All right, we're going to talk about a musical idea that, honestly, flipped everything on its head. And it didn't do it by adding more, it did it by taking pretty much everything away. This is the story of how less became the new more. Welcome to the architecture of noise.
Okay, so picture the 1960s. Musically, it was just an explosion of sound, right? I mean, you had the Beatles bringing in actual orchestras, producers were just piling on dozens of tracks. It was like the sonic arms race to see who could build the most massive, complicated, colorful sound. The whole philosophy was just more is always more.
But then, way over in a dusty New York loft, a world away from those slick London studios, a handful of artists started thinking, wait a second. They started asking a totally different question. What if the most revolutionary sound wasn't about adding stuff, but taking it away? What is the biggest, most powerful thing you could do was almost nothing at all?
And that's where we're going to start. While everybody else was busy building these huge sonic cathedrals, there was this one band that was basically doing the opposite. They were excavating, just stripping music all the way down to its bones. And yeah, you probably guessed it. That band was the Velvet Underground. I mean, look at this. The difference is just night and day. On one side, you've got mainstream rock, right? It's all about orchestras, complex layers, these big psychedelic metaphors. And then there's the Velvet Underground. Instead of complexity, they gave you the drone. Just one single pulsing note. Instead of lush arrangements, you got raw, almost brutal repetition. And they threw out all that psychedelic fantasy stuff for the cold, hard reality of the street. So how did they actually do it? Let's get into their blueprint, because this wasn't just some sloppy rock and roll, no. This was a full-on artistic philosophy. It was built on a couple of key ideas. First, essentialism, boiling everything down to what's absolutely necessary. And second, entropy, this idea of just embracing chaos and decay.
Okay, first up, the drone. This was John Cale's big contribution, coming straight out of the avant-garde world. So forget about chord changes. Instead, the whole foundation of the song is just one single, sustained note that just vibrates. It's so hypnotic, but it's also really tense. And it makes you stop listening for a melody and start listening to the texture of the sound itself. It's a total shift in focus.
All right, then you've got the heartbeat of the whole operation, the Mo Tucker beat. So the drummer Maureen Tucker, she played standing up. She used mallets a lot of the time instead of sticks. And get this, she barely used any cymbals. So what you end up with isn't some fancy rhythm you can dance to. It's this simple, primal, totally unshakable pulse. It literally sounds like the steady, mechanical heartbeat of a city. And then, of course, there are the words. Lou Reed's lyrics were the absolute polar opposite of all that peace and love stuff that was happening. He wasn't a poet. He was more like a journalist. He was just reporting, with this cold, detached eye on what he saw on the fringes of society. No flowery metaphors, just the raw, unfiltered truth of what was going on. So the Velvet Underground basically planted the seed. And then, about a decade later, in the super gritty, crumbling New York of the late 70s, something else started to grow from it. Something kind of twisted, but also kind of beautiful. This was no wave. You can think of them as the nihilistic heirs to the Velvet's throne. Yeah, the whole point of no wave was to just reduce music to its most jagged, primitive parts. I mean, if the Velvet stripped music down to a skeleton, no wave came along and just smashed that skeleton into a million little pieces. It was a sound born directly out of a city that felt like it was falling apart. And what's so fascinating is how they took the View's ideas and just pushed them to the absolute extreme. They were all about anti-virtuosity, a fancy way of saying they didn't care if you could play your instrument. What mattered was the sound you could get out of it. They took that drone idea, but just got rid of the melody entirely, leaving behind nothing but harsh noise. And you know that chaotic Velvet Underground album, White Light, White Heat? For them, that wasn't just an experiment. That was the whole manifesto. Okay, but while New York was just exploding with all this noise, something else was happening across the Atlantic. A whole other movement was taking that same Velvet Underground DNA and spinning it in a completely different direction. And that was post-punk, the cold, kind of geometric air. The whole vibe of post-punk was all about these lonely, repetitive pulses. See, where no wave was this big, chaotic explosion, post-punk was an implosion. It was a sound that was all about space and atmosphere and this really deep, industrial kind of sadness.
So you had bands like Joy Division and Wire, and they used that VU minimalism to basically weaponize silence. Space itself became an instrument. They grabbed Mo Tucker's steady beat and they just cranked it up, turning it into that relentless forward-driving motoric beat. You know, that steady 4/4 rhythm. It feels like you're in a machine just barreling down a highway. And of course, they totally adopted Lou Reed's deadpan vocal style, which gave everything this cool, intellectual, and kind of distant feeling. So this chart really lays it all out, doesn't it? You can see the family tree right here. That original Velvet Underground drone, it splits. For no wave, boom, it becomes pure, harsh noise. For post-punk, it becomes this cold, empty, atmospheric space. And that simple beat, in New York, it gets jagged and primitive. Over in the UK, it gets steady and industrial. It's literally the same genetic code, just mutated to survive in two totally different environments. So, okay, after all that noise and all that space and all that repetition, what's the big takeaway? What's the lasting impact here? Let's get into the legacy of less. And, you know, it's a totally fair question. Why does any of this matter? Why should we care that a couple of bands decided to play fewer notes? What's the so what of it all? Well, it mattered because it took this really intimidating, kind of highbrow world of the avant-garde, and it put its tools right into the hands of any kid with a cheap guitar and a cool idea. It wasn't just about music, it was about making it okay for anyone to experiment. Think of it like a chain reaction, a path of permission. Step 1, the Velvet Underground comes along and proves that a single repeated idea can be a total masterpiece. Okay, cool. That gives No Wave the permission to say, hey, maybe just pure noise can be art too. And then that gives post-punk the permission to build these huge atmospheric worlds out of almost nothing, out of pure emptiness. And that right there is the real genius of this whole thing. By saying no to all the tools everybody else was using, by choosing to limit themselves, they ended up discovering things that nobody else could. That limitation actually became their greatest strength. It forced them to be creative in ways that a band with a million options never would have to be. When you boil it all down, they really taught the music world two huge lessons that still resonate today. Number 1, repetition isn't boring. When you do it on purpose, it's incredibly powerful and hypnotic. And number 2, noise, distortion, feedback, those aren't accidents you need to fix. They're choices. They're just as expressive as any note. So that kind of leaves us with one last thing to chew on. By throwing out all the rules, all the conventions, did the Velvet Underground and everyone they inspired accidentally stumble upon a really weird truth, that maybe the ultimate creative freedom isn't having endless choices, but having almost none at all?